I'm going to go up and down the row and let people introduce themselves and what they do. I'll start with the lovely lady to my left.
My name is Luna Farrow. I am a maker of horse noises. I produce grimdarks, horror, and gothic fanfic on my channel. I also create... My microphone seems to be quite quiet today. I don't know what's going on. It could be just me. However, yes, my name is Luna Farrow. I am a bat pony extraordinaire, mother of darkness. I create horse noises on my channel. That's who I am. I'm also Discount Cygnus for today.
She's raising the tone of this place. And to my right, we'll start with you.
Hello everyone, I'm a Ranger Pony. I'm better known for my overpowering voice. I'm mostly known for my voice acting stuff on YouTube, mostly the stuff I've done for this nice lady. Of everybody on the panel today, I'm the least qualified to answer your questions about writing, but yeah. Thank you.
Narrator, that last bit was such a lie. Hi everyone, I am Thornquill. I've produced a number of fanfic readings, and I'm also the author of Carousel, which is a ghost horror story. And
it's sold out in 2 days. Yeah! So you don't have a copy now.
A round of applause for the bookstore.
And I'm also the author of Heteropaternal Superfecundation, which, in addition to being incredibly hard to pronounce, is only best described as a train wreck.
True story. That was written after hour 23 of a 24-hour car journey back from BronyCon, where I was reading out Cards Against Humanity cards, and he came up with a fic from it.
Oh no!
So go and check that one out on his fanfiction. It is glorious. Right. So today we are going to attempt to be somewhat. Thank you, darling. But we're going to attempt to be like educational in as much as we can. Yeah, who the heck are we? Why do we not think we know what we're talking about? We have been either reading fanfics or writing fanfics for a great many years. Between all of us, we have over a decade of experience in various different fandoms and fanfictions. So we were going to furnish you with the fruits of our labours, such as they are, and explain a few things that we have picked up along our merry way. So I'm going to just be covering the basics, because, you know, I'll be basic. And I'm covering things like planning your fic, the things that come before you put pen to paper, or things that come before you stare with increasing desperation at the blinky cursor on a blank screen. So whatever you think, and I know that there are people up here who will fight me on this, planning is important. Now, the drawbacks to not having a plan, this is the one that usually gets me, is that you have wonderful ideas, but if you're not planning it, you're not writing it down, you lose interest in what you're writing and things go unfinished. Sometimes the story gets very messy. You have plot threads that start and don't go anywhere. There are a great many Fallout stories that kind of do this. It is a fandom unto itself within the pony fandom, and there are a lot of stories in it whereby they have individual plot threads that don't go anywhere because it was too sprawling. Plot holes, contradictions to earlier things in the text. I have done this in Vampirelance. I originally wrote Vinyl as having a black mane and tail, and then I decided that she was going to be albino, and I forgot to take that out of the early chapters and got called out on it in a YouTube video. So don't do that. Your characterization can suffer if you're not keeping track of where your characters started and where you want them to go. They can seem to vacillate between one place and another if you're not planning on the end point. And too many subplots sneak in. Green.
Yeah. Say no more.
Yeah. So, I'm just going to show you a couple of planning techniques. These are not the only ones available. These are the ones that I've had either experience with, or I know people who've used them and I found them useful. The first one's called the 8-step technique. This is one of the more complicated ones. Step 1, you have your one sentence summary. You just write down in a single sentence what your story is about. It's kind of like the summary blurb that you would find on the back of a novel. Then you open that out to a 5-sentence paragraph. So you're opening out more what you intend to do with the story. You give your basic character synopses, so who are your characters, where are they coming from, what are they doing, who are they, especially if you're working with old characters. Have an idea of who they are to begin with at the start. Divide your plot into 3 acts, thinking about pace and flow. What happens when? Do you have all of your action front-loaded into the first act and make it rather boring for people? Is it that it only gets good in the 3rd act? You may need to revisit your structure. It's like it needs to be getting good near at the start, or you're going to lose your reader's interest. Expend your characters in step 5, and I think we can all agree, research is king. If you are not familiar with something to do with your character, research it. You don't need to be an expert, but you need to at least sound like you know what you're talking about. I have been in the middle for a long time, of writing a story set in a hospital called Playing With My Heart. And right at the very start, I put Octavia into a coma. She's been in a coma for the whole story, because, you know, Suffolk. But at the very start, I had to look up something called the Glasgow Scale, because that rates like sensitivity and levels of consciousness in a coma. I had no idea that was a thing. But because I did my research, I was able to make the doctor characters in the story sound like they knew what they were talking about. And even though I hadn't got a lot of information, it gave it an air of credibility within the story itself. Set in the scene, same thing, do your research. If it's set in a city, get your terms right. If it's set in the countryside, get your terms right. Step 7, you don't even start writing the story until the 7 steps of an 8-step process, and the final edit and redraft it. So there's an option here for a beta reader, either a friend, or you can join groups on fanfiction who will help you to edit your story. Yeah, I can see cameras and things popping up around the room. I will make this available online. If anybody follows me on Twitter, I will make this available, the entire PowerPoint, afterwards. Okay? You're welcome. This one is called the corkboard technique. Now, I picked this up from Jenna Moresi. Go and subscribe to her. She's a really, really useful author. She doesn't write ponyfic, but she writes her own novels. She has YouTube channels full of writing tips. Hers is the idea that you pin everything onto a corkboard with pins, and then you rearrange your plot to make sure that the pace and flow work properly. We've also got mind mapping for those who are more into visuals. So it's called a pictographic brain dump tool, meaning that you get all the, no, it doesn't mean you do it on the computer. Although sometimes it feels like the brain. It's the idea that you just get everything that's in your head down all at once. Screw the order, you don't care about the order, you just want everything out of your head. The point is not to go into detail, empty your brain of all your ideas, just get it down, pick out what works, because everything you put down may not work. It may well be that you look at things and think, that logically doesn't make sense. It was a nice idea, but it's not actually going to work. The order doesn't matter. Put it down whenever and wherever it comes to your mind. Start linking the ideas together, and then you get your plot out of that. It is extremely non-linear, so you don't have to do things in order. You don't have to think, where am I starting? Where am I going? You plop everything down together and sort it out afterwards. It can look a little bit like this. There are some mind mapping programs that you can find online. There's some, the more advanced ones you have to purchase, but there are free ones available, and they can be really, really handy if like charts, flow charts and things are more your thing for planning. So I would definitely advise it if you're more interested in like images and colours and your brain is more keyed toward that, mind mapping might be for you. Start with the ending. Now this is the one that I use more than anything. I know where I want my story to go. I usually come up with the ending first and I work my way toward that point. That does tend to be easier if you've been writing for a long time. And I've been writing fan fiction since 2001, so I've been writing it longer than probably most people in the room have been alive. God damn it, I'm old. Yeah, that one, when you've been doing it for a while, that one becomes easier. There's also something called the dialogue pass, where you let the characters talk. If you know the characters really well, and this is especially good for like canon characters when you have a good grasp of their personality, don't write any narrative. Just let them talk. Add your narration afterwards. Let them have a conversation, see where it goes, and then add in your dialogue points, how they're saying the lines, what they're doing while this is going on, what's happening. Like in real life, conversation can lead to interesting places. So the voices come through, they drive the story.
When the shopping carts come out, however, they tend to derail the panel.
Yeah. They're taking away the bodies from the last panelists. They were taking too long, so we got rid of them. You can't have grimdark authors up here with having at least one dead body joke. Right, so this is really, really handy for character-driven storytelling. And as we know with Pony, it being a slice of life series, characterization is key, but it does require a really strong grip of the characters. For more ideas, these are some good places. Again, I'll put this online, but if you'd like to take a gander at these. I've got Chuck Wendig, who comes up with 25 different planning techniques that might work for you. The Writers Bureau, Grammar Girl, and then we've got on YouTube, Jenna Moresi, Tom Palmer, Mr. Salis Teaches English, which is something that is used in UK English exams for GCSE, but is actually really handy for story writing, and Mr. Bruff. Mr. Bruff's amazing. Just making sure I'm not taking up too much of my time, everybody else's time. So, yeah, first lines. Anybody who came to the workshop for Them's Writing Words last year knows how much of an absolute tantrum I had about first lines. And I'm going to do it again because it's my panel on the cap.
You're usually doing your bloopers, so why not?
Yeah, the first line is usually the one I absolutely screw up. Yeah. So, we have something called the SADs, where you pick one of these to start your story with. Either the setting, so there's a famous author called Brian Jakes who writes the Redwall series. He always starts with a page of pure description of the setting of his story. It doesn't always work. I must admit, I do skip over the first page of his books to get to where the characters come into things, but sometimes that is the best way to go, especially if you're setting things in an unfamiliar location. We've also got action, or sometimes known as in media res, where you drop the reader right into the middle of a scene that's already going on, and you credit your reader with the intelligence to figure out what the hell is going on and follow the story from there. Now, the good thing about that is it makes them intrigued right from the get-go. Ooh, what's going on? I need to work this out. I need to use my brain. It can be quite confusing, though, so you need to be careful with that one. Start with dialogue is the same thing. Start in the middle of a conversation, like in media res. Same idea. It gets people intrigued, but you have to be careful it's not confusing. And the last one, you start with just an interesting statement like, love sucks, doesn't it?
Yes.
Oh, who said yes? Who was that? Oh, bless. Right. Please, please, please. Avoid it was a blank day in Ponyville.
It was a dark and stormy night in the Everfree Forest.
Can we just get rid of this boo-hockey, please?
I want to see a bunch of you on your phones deleting right now.
Unless you're going to purposely using it.
It was a very cliched day in Ponyville.
Now, we can use this litmus. Now, I've nicked this from Chris from One Man's Pony Ramblings. Read his reviews, because he reviewed a lot of pony fiction, and you can pick up a lot of tips and tricks for what works and what doesn't. But he has otherwise known as, how effective is this sentence in both preparing me for the story I'm about to read and encouraging me to continue reading?
I'm sorry, can you do that? Read that acronym one more time, please.
You do it.
Okay, heights.
I think you did wonderful.
Just rolls off the tongue.
It's very fun at parties.
Yes, Goody's right, it's Norwegian.
Or Welsh.
I would have a lot more phlegm in it if it was Welsh. So yeah, this is my absolute favourite line from Ponyfic ever. Because I think it does everything the first line of a Ponyfic should do. In the darkness, some pony coughed. Ooh. And for those who've read this story, they know where this goes. I love this. Now, for me, this fulfills several different parts of SADS. It's an opening statement, It also drops us in the middle of the action and lets us figure out what the heck is going on. But it also sets the scene somewhat, the idea of it being completely dark, and we don't know who's coughed, we can't see them. So it fulfills quite a lot of these, and it does intrigue the reader into thinking, where is this going? What's going on? In a different way, this is another favourite line of mine from the beginning of the story. Dear reader, on my first day in Equestria, I had my throat torn out. I know, huh? Not what you'd expect from a cartoon world of happy, carefree ponies who learn about the magic of friendship. Nope, I get baptised into my new life with a fight to the death. What a way to wear out the welcome wagon. Now this is from the ballad of Echo the Diamond Dog by Rust. Oh, apparently I got... I was about to say I got rust in my throat then, but that's wrong, no.
In the brightness of the panel room, someone coughed.
It's begun.
Somebody turn off the lights in the darkness so when you cough.
In the brightness of the panel room, someone coughed.
Little Mint all over again. Little Mint revenge. Yeah, this one I think it gets the tone of the narrator across, the sarcastic idea. It definitely intrigues you what's going on. It's a strange statement. It drops in the middle of the action. And this story, it's one of an older story. Why do I keep nearly tonguing the mic? The joke is actually lipstick on the mic now. Sorry. I don't know. I don't know how I do anything. I don't know how I get up in the morning. Alright. This does everything I think a good story should do. It intrigues, it gets the personality of a brand new narrator across, and it makes you want to read on to find out more. And there's one more I'm going to do, but I'm not going to explain this opening line to you. In fact, no I am. Wait, sorry. This is the opening of Vampirelance, a story on my channel. Vinyl knew something was wrong the moment she stepped through the front door, just setting tone and atmosphere on this one. But the moment the story opened, I love in media res. So Vinyl steps into the house and immediately something is wrong. But the one I actually want to show you is this. And I'm going to hand it over to this gentleman over here to explain this opening line.
Okay, so this is the opening line of my story, Carousel. And I will just note this was not the line that I started writing the story with. I started writing the story with the weather report. I came up with the first line in editing, so if you don't have the banger right out of the gate, then that's fine. That's what editing is for. But so this one, the sight of Ponyville had never made Rarity feel so miserable. So for me, a really important part of the first line is for the reader to have a question in their mind. In this case, the hope is, well, Ponyville's Rarity's home. The version of her that we know from the show is really happy there. Why does the sight of Ponyville make her miserable? And it also gives us some insight into her character, her state of mind, what kind of place she's at. And it sets the tone of the story, which is a great deal of misery. So that was my mindset in coming up with this particular first line.
Yep, and that definitely fits the theme of the story all the way through. So it sets up narratively the tone that Carousel maintains. And that's really what you want your first line to do, is to be a good indication of what the reader is in for with the story. So they can make a judgment call on whether they want to read on, which you totally should, because Carousel is awesome. And now I'm going to hand over to Luna Farrow to talk about theme and narrative voice.
So, all right, so we did talk about planning. That's actually a heavy part of what I'm going to be talking about here, because when I go into writing, and admittedly I don't share a lot of my writing with other people or on fanfiction, I go into it with the intent that there will be a message or a purpose behind everything that I'm doing. So everything in the story for me has to be connected, and that even comes down to the style of writing itself, the way in which you characterize the characters, and even the extent to which you reveal the world around you. Like, everything has to be done with a purpose, and that purpose should be related to the central idea behind your story. So that would be your theme, one big idea for your story built on many small details, which would be that the building blocks of your story down to the very sentences, how they're put together, the words that you choose. Why narrative voice matters is because it greatly influences what the reader is going to get from what they're reading. Like what you intend for the story to give to somebody is going to be very different from what somebody actually receives. You can always do everything in your power to make sure that what you're writing is what somebody else gets, but even the very, very best stories, people still get different ideas out of them, and it's important to read that into them. I'm sorry, I just hit the slide a bit too early. So, no, I want to So you can use your narrative voice to develop your character to the deepest detail by choosing the perspective, by choosing what the reader sees through the character's eyes or through the eyes of the narrator, whichever one you're using. It can depend. And it also shows when you write really well that everything you're doing was a deliberate choice and was intended to bring the reader to a certain conclusion or to a certain place as you were planning to do with the characters. So the question would be, am I using my writing effectively? Are you using motifs, pacing, description, perspective, how those pieces fit together? Motifs are, this is all a lot of stuff that I know because I paid attention in English class a long time ago. And then paid attention in Russian literature, but motifs are really important for writing like a story that has a special meaning to you. The theme is built upon motifs, like say, what's a good one? What can you think of?
A story with a theme?
No, just motifs that you've seen in stories.
Paintings in Carousel, the idea of art.
The paintings, yep. There's that. The Cold Hand of Mercy was a fic that I read, and that invoked colour and the changing of seasons as a way to change the mood of the story as well. So that's another one. Your pacing also is really important. You can slow down your pacing with how much description you choose to put into something versus how little. So say you wanted to go really fast and make it feel like it's going really fast, you can write it all in like one long sentence with minimal punctuation and make it seem like it's a blur and confusing for the character because it's just confusing for the reader. Similarly, you can make something seem slow something down by putting it into intimate detail, and that also paints a very vivid picture of what's going on. So everything you do with your words really affects what type of story, what the person is receiving, what kind of scene you're portraying to the reader. That does include description. The kind of perspective you're choosing too, that matters. As I said before, the perspective that you give your story completely controls what the reader sees and how they discover what you're trying to show them. Try to discover, and it controls what they're able to get from what they're reading. So, for instance, if you choose third person limited, that's if you say, Twilight Sparkle went to Carousel Boutique and Rarity was sitting there reading a book. That would be third person limited, whereas first person limited would be I, Twilight Sparkle, went to Carousel Boutique and went to see Rarity for lunch. But and those actually show completely different sides of the character because third person is slightly more distanced. You can read it as if you are still reading them. First person is more like first person limited is more like, it's like the person is telling the story to you, so it's even more limited. It's like hearing somebody's life story given to you, and you have to take, and this immediately should force the reader into a sense of skepticism, because first person limited because it's very didactic and gives people the sense that they're being talked to by somebody in person. You don't know how recent the story happened to them or how long ago they experienced it, unless it's written in the first person, and not in the first person, unless it's written in the present tense. I'm sorry, I'm having a food coma. And then third person omniscient can be interesting. That's also one that I see sometimes, and I've actually written in third person omniscient. And that's something you can write in when you want somebody to, when you want to see the story as a whole through all the characters' perspectives and show the reader something and show the reader perhaps a bit of dramatic irony. Say, you want to show two characters who have completely different perspectives on something in the same scene, and what you're using with the third person omniscient is displaying, making a commentary on both of those people's perspectives on the relationship between those characters. Whereas third person limited, you're telling more of a story about that specific person and showing, and either making a commentary on them in particular, or trying to show that you consider their perspective more important, or that you want the reader to identify with that character. A particular thing that I have always believed for a long time, perspective-wise, is that the protagonist you read is the good guy. I put that in quotes because that's the character you're always intended to identify with. So if you want to tell a story about redemption, you want to tell a story about somebody being a terrible person you can still sympathize with, make that person your protagonist and give them a journey. If you want somebody to be unsympathetic, if you want somebody to be harder to relate to, villains can be antagonists can still be sympathetic, but because you do not see them through their own eyes, they're inevitably made the other, the outsider, the different one. And so you can use your narrative voice, you can use your writing to play upon that relationship inherently. I'd like to give some examples of literary, non-fanfiction pieces that I have read or studied or really enjoy, that I really think put into perspective, that give you a good example of different tools that I've showed to you today. As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner is a very famous story about a family taking their dead mother by a cart pulled by a mule to bury her in her homeland 30 miles away. And while it doesn't seem like that's a long distance now, sorry, they're still grinding up the bodies.
Yeah, it's Rainbow Factory.
In so many places, they're still finding it. If you get cupcakes, darling, I don't want any.
Hey, that's a good idea.
In Baltimore.
He's not lying.
Alright, I'm going to cut things off pretty quickly. I just want to give you some examples of things that would work. So I hope you got some of those. So As I Lay Dying is a good one. I find that the example of foreshadowing used in Anna Karenina is very good. It's the showing of a horse dying before the protagonist then dies. Hunchback of Notre Dame, I think, is an excellent example of using what seems to be unnecessary description to integrate the reader into the story into the world of where the story is happening, and creating a character out of a fixture or an environment. And The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman's one of my favorite authors.
Because he's awesome. Seriously.
I particularly like The Graveyard Book as an example of perspective, because that shows the growth of a child from being very, very young and very innocent into growing a greater understanding of the world and of the dangers in it as he gets older. So I do have some quick tips for you before we finish up, and I can't see. It's while it's important to know what you're trying to get across to a reader when you're writing a story, it's also important not to overthink it. You don't want to sit there and be paralyzed thinking, oh God, what am I going to do? What am I going to write? How am I going to write this? What if this way that I'm writing isn't good enough or isn't going to portray what I'm trying to get through the right way? But at the same, so you want to focus on it as a goal. What do you want to get through with the story? How are you going to get there? Use Scribbler's planning tips as a way to get to map out those goals and those themes and those motifs. And when you catch yourself feeling like you've got writer's block, like there are no ideas coming, or like the ideas aren't good enough, or they're not written exactly the way you want them to, don't hesitate. Just write them down. Write down all those ideas as soon as you can, because 90% of writer's block is just self-doubt. And if you can just get those words onto the page and worry about how good or bad they are later, you'll be in much better shape.
Thank you, Luna. Now we're going to hand over to Thorny, who's talking about character depth.
Okay, so Scribbler kind of already touched on how MLP is a very character-driven franchise, but having your characterization in place is important across all types of fiction that you're going to approach. And I'm blending themes a little bit here, both talking about character voice and what will drive them, because I think the solution to one is the solution to the other. So,
Sorry, just trundling the corpses across the table.
Dead bodies. Of course I'm going to get distracted. Dead bodies, Pepsi Max and dogs, that's my thing.
But yeah, so basically, fixing the problem of Pinkie Pie sounding like Pinkie Pie, and that's all that she does. We can move on to the next one, I think. Oh, I can control it. They're brilliant.
Yeah.
The things they invent these days. So basically, fanfics where Pinkie Pie is in the story, and I wish Starry was here to voice this. Basically, hi, I'm Pinkie Pie, and I'm throwing this party just to interrupt your dialogue. My Pinkie sense told me the author wanted me to break the fourth wall in this story. You get the idea. I think this is a thing that a lot of writers run into when they're first starting out, especially in fan fiction, because we have this wonderful show that gives us these wonderful characters and tells us exactly what they sound like. And it's very easy to start out. We start the story and we just write the character basically how they sound in the show, and not much gets added on to that. When this becomes a serious problem is when it starts making the characters very passive and when they don't actually add a purpose to the story. Big arrow. I can learn, I swear. And so really I think, again, the problem is having characters in fan fiction that are just there to react to things with a bit of flavor text, but it can also lead into the danger of having very passive characters. Passive characters sit around in the story waiting for things to happen to them. And when things happen, they react, and then the story moves on, something else happens, characters react, and on the cycle goes. The example of this that I really actually kind of hate is the classic Oliver twist. Because if you go and you look at Oliver, he's actually a very passive character. He doesn't make many choices or deliberate actions in the story. He's kind of there to experience the horrors of Victorian England, which in fairness was a very horrible place.
You're talking like it's not now.
I am not touching that can of worms. What did I just say?
I mean, I could make a joke about that, but if I start talking about hard and soft things, they'll throw me off the stage.
Nope.
We're dumping you in the harbour next.
No. At any rate, so what something to work on in stories is to be careful about trying to make your characters more active. Active characters will spend parts of the story making things happen. They take action that changes the way the story plays out. If they hadn't taken any action, it just would have run on without them. And especially if they can force other characters to adapt, if they have to change their plans because someone literally just messed something completely up, that is a very active character. Heist stories tend to be really good examples of having active characters because all the protagonists in heist stories are making plans. They're figuring out, what the bank plans are, where the security is, contingencies for when someone falls off the building or the helicopter gets stabbed in the elevator. And then, yeah. And then all of these things happen, and they have to come up with something to fix it. So that's a really good example of when characters can be more active. And just a really quick aside, sometimes characters are going to react to things, plot twists, the villains. The key is establishing a balance so that they're not just sitting there constantly and waiting to say Pinkie Pie things to whatever Starlight Glimmer has done next.
Starlight Glimmer, don't we mean Twilight Ponyface?
Bootleg Twilight.
Twilight number 2.
If you wanted to see authors fight, then...
I can take it.
And going another level deeper, the key to making your characters active is to think about what they desire. When you're writing your story, keep in mind what it is that the characters that you're putting into the story want. What do they want from life? What do they want out of the day? Kurt Vonnegut gave the example of you can write a stellar story about a character who just desperately wants a glass of water and cannot get one. And nowhere have I sympathized with that so much as some of the lines the past few days. And example of characters that are almost always proactive, villains. And this is why villains can sometimes be so much fun to watch. I really highly recommend just, if you're working on characterization, pay attention to whatever media you're taking in and look at the villains and look at how they are constantly active. Everyone has to react to them. Examples being Maleficent, who is a bit of a template for Nightmare Moon because she's just so delightful to listen to. Darth Vader, he's constantly the force that is coming at the Rebel Alliance, and they have to react to him to some extent.
Force.
The recent example being Thanos. Thanos is a brilliant example of a story being crafted around a villain as the protagonist.
All right, and that's not gonna help.
And
Just
honestly,
disappeared.
one of my favorite examples I threw in Prince Zuko, if you've ever seen Avatar: The Last Airbender. Yeah. But especially in the first season, you look at just how hard he is trying to accomplish everything and how much that throws everyone off. That is an active character. And I threw in an example of rarity in Carousel just because in a horror story, it's a little bit strange to write a longer story about a character who is choosing to remain in a place where horrible things are happening to them. If Rarity was a passive character, she would just stay there and react to all the spooky things happening to her and just go, I'll be here tomorrow too. That's okay. So what was really important to me was to know what Rarity wanted in this stage of her life and what that would drive her to do. This is early in Rarity's career, so she wants to open a boutique. She wants to succeed in her career, and she is afraid of failing and having to move back in with her parents and miss out on her chance to start out her career. And these desires are so strong for her that she will take on dangerous business deals, she'll lash out at the people closest to her if she thinks they're getting in her way, and she'll even try to deal with a malevolent, mysterious force because the alternative is something that she hates even more. So that's kind of the key to character depth is
Kind of like jobs.
your character doesn't want to deal with what's in front of them, but they want something beyond it even more, so they have to go through it.
Gonna find a life too.
So once you've got kind of that template, you know what your character wants and what is in their way in the story, they'll start to become a lot more interesting.
Stand by for the Rainbow Factory.
Sounds like the
Goron is backstage.
sounds like the Pegasus device needs a tune-up.
But yeah, and you'll notice that you'll actually start to build your characters more. You can start with Rarity or Starlight Glimmer or whatever, but once you're finished, I guarantee you will have a character that is more than the Rarity or the Starlight Glimmer or whoever in the show. You will have added something of yourself into that character, and that can seriously elevate fanfiction and go a long way. We will do some questions at the end as much as we have time for, so we'll try to get to it. But yeah, so this can go for OCs, but this goes double for original fiction writing. If you want to break into that at some point in the future, you'll just have to do more work thinking about what these characters want. So hopefully some of that made a lick of sense. And I will pass it over to narrator for his portion.
Thank you. All right, everybody. My name is Narrator Pony. I'll be doing a bit on world building, and particularly world building in fan fiction, which is a slightly different animal. So what is world building? Generally speaking, well, it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's a process of literally building the world that your story takes place in. Things like society, geography, history, culture, government, the flora and fauna, by which I mean plants and animals, and how these things will play into the story that you're trying to tell. So how does world building work in fan fiction specifically? Well, unlike building a world for an original story, in fan fiction we have like a common base to use as a jumping off point, right? We've all seen the show, we know more or less how it works. In the case of MLP fan fiction, the world that is Equestria. That means that a lot of the work has already been done for us, and this is one of the great things about fan fiction, in my opinion. You don't have to spend pages and pages building on the world and establishing the setting, because unless you specify otherwise, your readers already know all that, so you can jump right into the story that you are trying to tell. But there is still plenty of room to play. There's no reason you should feel constrained in your world building just because it all starts with a common foundation. You could do world building in Equestria's distant past or in the far future. What about all the places in Equestria that are only seen in passing? What about the places outside of Equestria? Griffins, zebras, dragons, changelings, maybe some other animal that we haven't even seen yet.
Stoats. Ferrets.
Sentient ferrets.
Oh my
I
God.
love it.
Sentient ferrets who breathe fire.
Humans.
Pheasants.
All right! They get the point.
Where's that cup?
And lastly,
Sorry.
you'll find so just about all fan fictions have to incorporate some element of world building, just kind of by necessity. You could call it like world building light or like world patching, right? Because technically, anytime you delve into an area not explicitly covered by a show canon, you've done like a little bit of world building. Depending on the story you're telling, it might be as simple as talking about an area of Ponyville that we haven't seen in the show, or it might be just like expounding on the way that like changeling magic works, you know, in Equestria. So unlike world building for an original story, world building in fan fiction just kind of involves a lot of what I call world patching, just kind of clarifying, touching up bits of world that aren't really well established in the show. So what I'd like to do now is go over some general tips and best practices, some do's and don'ts when world building fan fiction in no particular order. So when world building in fan fiction, and with fan fiction in general, it's important to establish when and where your story takes place relative to the world that we already know. So if your world starts off in Ponyville and like Twilight and her friends are there, you don't really have to take any extra steps. The reader can just pick up the story and know immediately what's going on. But if you're doing something more ambitious, something further from like what we know of Equestria already, it's a good idea to let the readers know how the two tie together. It doesn't have to be straight away, and you don't have to explicitly say so, but at least give the readers some clue as to the setting. If the setting of your story is too far afield from the show, at some point you can stop, it stops becoming a My Little Pony fanfiction and becomes something else entirely, and the moderators on fanfiction will probably not allow it. So anything published there, because everything published there has to be at least somewhat MLP related. And I gotta find my place again. I'm bad at this. Sorry, one second.
Try to swallow it in.
Quick. This using my phone as a remote seemed like a good idea at the time. Okay. When you're world building, it is very important to establish a strong sense of place. What do I mean by that? The world that you imagine for your characters is real to them, and you can see it in your mind's eye, but your readers won't see it unless you show it to them. You need to immerse your reader in the world as if they are right there alongside your characters. Got it! So what would they... This is the shittiest app ever.
I thought it was me who had to watch it.
Okay. Okay, one good example is Project Horizons in terms of establishing a good sense of place. Somber did a really good job.
Oh my God.
World building in particular, but in particular paid really close attention to the way he describes the city of Huffington, the way he describes the oppressive rain, what it looks and sounds like before and after the bombs fell, what things were like for the people that lived there. So if you, Somber did a lot of really great world building in Project Horizons. I think we can all agree. But in particular, pay attention to the way he establishes a sense of place. All right, let me do it. Here we go. All right. So if you're going, number 3, sweat the details. So if you're going all out and creating a world within...
Don't touch the screen!
Pay close attention to the way it all fits together. Things like infrastructure, government, religion, economy. So I don't necessarily mean that you have to build everything up in like Civilization 6 and know how everything works on a micro level. But it should at least be able to, has to be somewhat plausible. If your society has invented a particular like magical superpower or crazy technology, you need to fully account for the way that will affect your world. So if unicorns all of a sudden developed the ability to magically spawn into existence like food or any other item they thought they can think of, that would probably, like a lot of ponies would probably quit their job, right? Because they, and then like how does the government collect taxes, right? If nobody has to work anymore.
Did you know you're in a fantasy world? Taxes.
So your readers are willing to suspend disbelief to an extent, but if the world that you have built is too improbable, too far out there, then it can be kind of distracting. So a good example of this is Project Sunflowers, and there'll be some minor spoilers here. Project Sunflower, beg your pardon, by Hoopy McGee. So in this story, humans create a portal to Equestria in order to send someone there on a reconnaissance mission. They transform a human into a pony by means of this newly invented nanotechnology. And the author doesn't shy away from discussing at length the repercussions such a technology would have on the human race. Because if you can completely replace someone's body, that means you have now cured every disease out there. And so the author goes into a lot of detail as to like how that affects everything. There would naturally be a high demand for these facilities. And like, how do you prioritize who gets to go first? Well, you start with terminally ill children. The author, some people might have thought that part was boring, but I thought that was a really great example of sweating the details. Number 4. Now it's kind of this is like an author like power move. So it's tough to pull off well, but you can make your story about the world itself. So you can use the world that you've created to replace like any or all of the typical elements that we associate with storytelling, the setting of course, but also things like the character, plot, conflict, theme, narrative arc. You can kind of use your world building to supplant or augment any of those. So a great example of that is a story called The Library of Discord by Chinchulax. I thought I saw Chinchulax in here earlier. Here he is. Stand up.
Can we have a round of applause for Chinchulax? Go ahead.
Chinchulax actually invented he's also invented like a brand new genre of fanfic, which I like to call math porn.
Not
If you
interested.
haven't read the library Discord, everybody go read that. It's terrific.
Well, I wasn't ready for that.
So in the story, Twilight becomes trapped in an impossibly huge library. Now this is a story where the setting of the story kind of takes the forward. The setting sort of is the story, if you want to think of it that way. The world building itself is the story, depending on how you want to think of it. Ways into the depths by Penstroke. So Penstroke goes to great lengths to describe the darkness of the story, the creepiness of it, the oppressiveness, how it moves and reacts in response to other characters in the story. And in that way, you could almost say that the depths, the setting of the story, is a character into itself.
Also, Thornquill has a reading of it on his
Oh.
channel. We're all in.
Yeah, we're all in. So go subscribe to Thornquill and listen to that story. It's excellent.
Of course, self-promotion. This is BronyCon.
I mean, it says.
Have you seen my hat?
All right, and so I've given you a bunch of things to do in regards to world building and fan fiction. I'd like to end with one big don't. One thing you should never ever do in regards to world building and fan fiction. Is everybody ready?
Yeah.
Don't scrap your story you're writing just because a new episode aired and show canon now contradicts the world that you had been built for the story. Don't do that. I don't see her in here, but I had words with this author because I was really invested in that story. And I was like, oh, well, the new episode came out. Oh, I can't finish it. Don't do that. So don't scrap the story you're writing just because the new episode aired and the show canon now contradicts your story. This is a risk we run when writing fan fiction. It's inevitable. But when it does happen, it does not and should not instantly invalidate any and all fics where the story's author had something else in mind. There are plenty of instances where the show canon contradicts the comics canon, right? Or the comics contradict the comics, and even cases where the show contradicts the show. So Hasbro is not overly concerned about canon contradictions, and you shouldn't be either. Has anybody here ever read a story that had a headcanon that you like better than the show canon? See? So there you go. So there's already enough obstacles in the way of that fic you've got kicking around in your head, getting out into the world where people can read it. In my case, the biggest problem is procrastination. I don't know if any of you other writers have that problem. Yeah.
Oh, I'm not alone. Thank God.
Everyone.
But when the show canon and the world canon turns out to be different than the world you had in mind, don't let that stop you. Reasonable people will understand. Just put a little AU tag in the description or whatever you have to do. Don't do that. Thank you. And we have a little bit of time for questions, I think.
I'll just check it. Do we have time for questions? We have
5
5 minutes for questions. Right, if you are going to leave now, it's fine. We won't be offended. We just hate you forever.
There they go, dead to us.
Yeah.
Dead to us.
Shame.
Ding, ding, ding. Shame.
Just kidding.
We are kidding,
You're
yeah.
fine.
Just
You're fine.
no booty dolls, please.
Seriously.
We'll answer a couple of questions. It'll probably be from the front just so we can hear them. You got your hand up first.
So,
Hi,
you
Lynn.
mentioned the 3-act structure. Is that because it's the easiest to go to?
Yeah. Generally, the 3-act structure is the easiest, especially if you're more of a novice writer. If you are more well versed in it, then you can have a longer story that has arcs. The arcs themselves tend to have 3 acts within them.
Yeah, but so you mentioned 3-act just because
Because it is the simplest go-to for practice.
Okay.
Behind you?
Hi. Really important thing. So if you're trying to make government factions and like different like groups and stuff like that. I think it's really important to remember that like in nowhere in history does everybody agree on everything. So you've got this one faction, there will be people within that faction that disagree with what they're doing, or are less good at their job, or more good at their job. So one common pitfall in fiction is to make everybody the same. You know, so not all, even in like Star Trek and stuff like that, not all the Klingons are like bloodthirsty. Like somebody has to be a scientist or an engineer in order to like build these spaceships and stuff like that, right? So don't make them all the same. Put a little dissent within each faction. That'll make it a lot more believable.
And I'll chime in very quickly. Another approach, I don't know if this will help you or not, but you can also treat your factions as characters. So think about what your factions want, especially what they might lack, and especially if the different factions want different things that bring them into conflict, that can give you some directions to go to as well.
Okay,
All right, in the blue shirt, in the middle, you've been waiting very patiently.
Would you recommend a newer writer to start with one-shots or trying to plan out like a real short story, like 5-6 chapters?
I'm going to...
It really depends on the scope of the story you're trying to tell. I would start definitely simpler, and then work your way out as you get more confident.
Really, really good advice for new writers: just start small. So just like little one-shots, microfics and stuff like that. Just kind of dip your toes in the water a little bit. A lot of people have this really big, huge story idea they have kicking around their head for years and years. Maybe don't start with that one, because like as you get better at writing, you'll look back at that story and think, I should have done that better. Start small.
But
Microfics are definitely maybe not
But-
on the other end of it, but
I will contradict just a little bit, and I'll ask what you enjoy reading and what you feel like creating, because me, I actually don't like short stories very much, and I've never written one. Not once in my life. My first story was Carousel. It's 13 chapters long.
Yeah, well, not everybody can hit it out of the park the very first time, Thorny.
My point is, if you prefer writing longer stories, then go for it, but do try to keep your longer stories simple. I don't recommend having multiple point of view characters or doing weird things with time flow or anything like that.
Don't write a Fallout fic first. Okay, one more question. Do you want to pick?
Oh gosh, you in the front row there. Hi.
Yes. I was thinking of, is it possible to do a lot of a good how do you feel about backstories? Because I know I've seen that a lot in Vampirelance that Scribbler wrote, where Vinyl explains how she became a vampire and how she led to rebelling. And I don't want to get into spoilers or anything, so
I know how it
Well-
ends.
I've done that with several of my. I might do that with several of my characters, like how they got
Like
into
have
the-
flashbacks and go
Yes.
into their backstory. So
Yeah.
well, I clearly am biased, so I'll let the other three answer this one.
well, I would say that backstory is integral to a character, just in the sense that like your own memories are integral to you, but you would want to think of them in the same way. You would want to think of them for the character in the same way that a real person would think of theirs. Like they're only reminded of something when they smell a certain smell, or if they encounter a certain color or something, or see a certain like house. They're not necessarily fixated on their past all the time unless they have something really serious wrong with them, or they have something like if they're really seriously struggling with something. In the case of Vampirelance, you also want to consider that backstory is almost always related to the actual story at hand, and ideally you want to bring it in like a flashback, like a brief flashback maybe, or little hints to start to build a picture of what this character is and where they've been and who they have been before and what decisions they've made. And that should always tie in with the larger message of the story you're trying to tell.
Well, we have in fact run out of time, so thank you very much. We are all available on Twitter if you want to get all of us there.
Thanks for coming out, everybody.
Thank you for coming out.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming to us.